not being loud enough. My background is in chemistry and neuroscience. I've been with the department for 28 years. All of those years working in water resource protection and restoration and conservation programs for the department. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I certainly don't have the silver bullet for the magic answer. I don't think anybody does up here. We've heard how complicated these systems are, how each is unique in its own way. The stresses that they face are unique. So, no one-size-fits-all kind of program is going to bring all the springs back to what everybody, I think, in their minds wants them to be. I recently completed service on a National Academy of Sciences panel evaluating the nutrient reduction strategies being employed in Chesapeake Bay. And when I think about the complexities associated with Florida springs and the spring sheds and the size of those spring sheds and the different land uses that occur in those spring sheds, there's a lot of commonality with the challenges that are faced by the 6 states and the District of Columbia that are responsible for recovering the Chesapeake Bay. There's a lot of similarity. The challenges we face here in Florida in the springs aren't unique to the springs. We face the same challenges in the Caloosahatchee watershed and in the Lake Okeechobee watershed and in the Greater Everglades ecosystem. So we have no shortage of challenges that we face moving forward. The role of my department in all of these collectively statewide, most focused, I think, for the longest period of time, right here in the Suwannee watershed and the Santa Fe watershed and the springs associated with them, is the application of the best available science and technology on the land that we can possibly apply. You've heard about, I think Eric mentioned nutrient management, keeping the nutrients in the root zone. That is an absolute goal of my office and the programs that we try to implement across the landscape. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, that's money. Nobody wants to waste those inputs. Irrigation management, conservation, is a critical component to nutrient management. The nutrients move with the water. So if you're doing the best job you can, if you're using every drop of water as efficiently as you can, applying only the amount of water that the crop needs, you're doing about the best that you can do to manage that nutrient and its movement or its static condition in the root zone where the plant can take it up. The challenge that we face is that the most efficient irrigation system and the most rigorous nutrient management plan cannot account for Mother Nature, cannot account for the 2-inch rainstorm that rolls across the landscape day after tomorrow or next week and flushes that root zone of any nutrients that are there. It's not a controlled environment that the agricultural producers work in. I heard reference to big ag this morning. There is no big ag in this water management district. There are some large farms, but there's no big ag. Most of the people that are engaged in agriculture in this water management district are small family farms. They're people just like you. They go to your church. Their kids go to school with your kids. They're members of the same clubs that you're members of. It's not this distant big ag community out there that everybody can point their finger at. They're your neighbors. And the kinds of things that we're talking about doing to change the activities on the landscape to save the springs are going to impact those people. So, how do you, these are not easy questions, nor easy programs to implement. They're complicated. There are no victimless programs moving forward. I understand your passion. Everywhere I go, the audiences that I talk to, whether they're Friends of the Everglades, whether it's the Everglades Foundation, whether it's the Lake Okeechobee folks, or the Caloosahatchee Estuary folks, they're just as passionate as you are. And they don't understand why we can't act tomorrow and fix it. It doesn't work. The questions up here about giving the kernels, what do you think needs to be done? We know what needs to be done. We need to optimize, we need to conserve, we need to put the nutrients out there only in the amount that we need, but we don't use nutrients 100% efficiently. None of you sitting in this room utilizes 100% of the nitrogen and phosphorus that you take in food and drink. It's in your waste products. That's why we have water treatment plants, to control that nitrogen, those nutrients. Plants that we utilize for food and feed and fiber aren't 100% efficient. There's always going to be nutrients left in the root zone, or nutrients left in the field, even in the most efficient application of modern agricultural production practices. That's just a fact of life. We can look at genetics to improve the genetics of plants and plant materials so they can become more efficient. But there's always going to be the root mass, the plant tissue, the leaves that fall off the plants, the parts of the plant that don't get harvested and removed from the field that are going to be left out there. They're going to decay. It's going to improve water holding capacity. That organic matter helps improve water holding capacity and nutrient cycling. But there's never going to be an agricultural production system that is nutrient neutral. Not with today's level of technology. The length of time the systems will take to recover themselves will be what they will be. I don't have a solar ball. Nobody does. We don't know how long it's going to take. You could stop applying nutrients to the landscape tomorrow. And it might be 20 years, or 25 years before you see it in the springs. We know that from data the district and my agency and DEP funded from the USGS. A good friend of mine, Brian Katz, did a lot of that work. Carbon dating the water. Fixes today aren't going to manifest themselves overnight. I just got the hook.
Would you like to question?
Do you want to say anything else before questions?
No, I can stop right there and answer questions.
No, that's a very good introduction. I think you will have some questions.
Yeah, I expect it.
Kathleen, you want this?
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Kathleen McKee, and I heard talk about the best possible technologies to keep water and fertilizer near the root zone. And to me, this sounds like a very expensive endeavor for a farmer. And I guess I'm wondering, how can a farmer compete in that environment against farmers in other countries that don't have the pressures of clean water that we have here? And should these costs be paid by society? Should society help pay for the cost of farming?
Well, there's a lot in that question. Certainly, I think most of us, the Western world in general, takes their food supply for granted because we've been so efficient and so productive. I mean, American agriculture feeds the world. It's just a fact. Can we continue to do that? I don't know. I don't know. Many of us, I think, like I said, that we kind of take our food supply for granted because we've never really wanted for anything. It is expensive, and you heard about reference to cost share programs. We fund cost share programs. The Water Management District leverages money. The federal government leverages money to put in place, like you saw when you entered in here, when you turned off of the main hard road onto the dirt road that came down here. You saw on the left-hand side 3 or 4 center pivots, all of which have been retrofitted through our cost share program to the most efficient form of irrigation that's currently available by technology, about 95% efficient. Those drop nozzles that put the water just above the landscape, very uniform, very low volume, very little drift, very little waste. Those are the kinds of projects that we're cost sharing. When you match those with soil moisture probes and on-site weather stations that are relatively inexpensive, landowners have access to those data on their smartphones. They can see whether it's raining on their center pivot from 10 miles away. Some of them can actually turn their systems on and off with their smartphones. We're advancing those technologies out there now, but there's a cost associated with it. The question of whether society should pay, society already is paying in some respects because those are tax dollars being used to offset the cost of implementing those technologies. That answer your question?
I was
was wondering about the price of food. The price of food in the United States is much
cheaper than anywhere else in the world.
So that, I think that's what I was referring to, is the price of food that we expect to pay versus the quality of the environment that we expect, which is affected by farmers.
Right. Yeah, I mean, those are big policy issues, no question about it.
Over here, sir.
Yes.
Mr. Budell, I too noticed those center pivots. They weren't there 15 years ago. Wonder who paid the majority of the cost of those center pivots. Were they federal cost-sharing programs that put in all that irrigation?
Federal cost-share programs don't pay for new irrigation. They only pay to retrofit existing.
And it seemed to me they were irrigating pasture. Is that a useful? Is that a?
Well, they weren't on at all, so I don't know if they're irrigating the pasture.
That's all that's there. That's the pasture.
Well, that's this time of year. It'll be in something other than pasture, or they wouldn't have an irrigation system. It's
so?
not profitable to irrigate pasture.
I think so too. That makes Adena Springs an interesting proposition.
This is very difficult. Who was up first?
I've already asked a question.
Steve, go ahead.
I'm Steve Baker with our Santa Fe River. It's just rumor, but I've heard rumors that in Nebraska, the state pays farmers not to farm certain crops in certain areas. Have you, do you have any information on that?
I don't have any information on Nebraska's program specifically. There's a long history of federal cost share programs for setting aside land, sensitive lands, from farming, paying growers not to farm certain areas. I don't know that those have ever been tied to surface water quality issues or groundwater recovery issues or anything like that. There's a history of programs for setting aside lands and payment to set lands aside and leave them fallow.
Question over here.
You mentioned that all situations are complicated and unique, but you have two basic drivers: too much nitrate, too little water. And so those are the basic things that go into the equation. You can improve the science greatly, even though agriculture is doing a very fine job in Florida. We may not have big agro business, but we do have large farms. We have large bare soil farms like the tomato operations up in Hamilton County, where the evaporation must be tremendous. That goes to the gentleman's question about where you're growing. But we really have no gauging of what those farms are using. So how can you apply your knowledge to an equation when you don't know? You know, you may be permitted to take out so much. We don't know whether they're taking out that much, or whether they're taking out twice that much, or 3 times that much, or whatever. So without that sort of information, I don't see how you can make much progress in terms of what agriculture does in terms of being effective with its use of water.
Well, there are very aggressive metering programs across the state that affect agriculture. An awful lot of metering data is available. I know Ann wants to address this issue relative to what the Water Management District is implementing soon.
But it's not required, right?
No, it's mandatory. Absolutely required. And, well, not in Suwannee, perhaps, but it is in South Florida, it is in South
We're here.
Just letting you know, our rule goes into effect in about 8 days. It will be required. We are the last water management district to get to that point, but our rule is filed and will be in effect in about 8 days.
That's good, because when Mr. Marzolf said you were using the lowest quality water and the least amount that was necessary, I wondered how you can determine that when agriculture is the biggest user and it's not metered. So you have no basis for making that decision.
Jean Wanzer, Gilchrist County. I'd like to ask what your agency and all of your agencies can do to encourage forestry as the best use of our land. I'm seeing a lot of Gilchrist County right now being converted from forest land to cropland with their irrigation program. Thank you.
Bob, that needs to be the last question.
I'm sorry, that's the last one? That's a good question. Rich, do you have an answer for that?
Well, it's more of a statement. I mean, we do promote forestry all the time. We agree. It is probably the most benign land use as it relates to water quality or water quantity impacts. Generally, it's a low user of water. The rainfall that occurs is really all that's used. It provides open space, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, groundwater recharge, all of those kinds of things benefit. There are other ag land uses that create the same benefit. Native range, unimproved pasture lands, those kinds of, which is the largest landscape in the Florida ag mosaic, have tremendous environmental benefit. And I just mentioned groundwater recharge, wildlife habitat, corridors, all those kinds of things accrue to low intensity pasture or unimproved pasture lands.
Thank you. Very good presentation.